Hi, this is Tasha Austin, host of Critical Conversations with NJTESOL-NJBE, where we discuss how to counter anti-Black racism in language education, starting with ourselves. This month's resource is The Weaponization of English by Dr. Kisha C. Bryan and JP Gerald. Our guest is Executive Board member and graduate student and teaching assistant Anel V. Suriel. Thanks for joining us. Now let's have a critical conversation.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tasha Austin, and I am the host of Critical Conversations with NJTESOL and NJBE, where we talk about how to counter anti-Black racism, starting with ourselves. I'm very excited to have, for our second episode, my guest, Anel V. Suriel, who will introduce herself to you all.
Saludos a todos. I am Anel Vanessa de Suriel, Anel Vanessa Suriel. I am the graduate student representative for NJTESOL-NJBE. I am a PhD student at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education and a 13-year bilingual practitioner.
Yes, and she does the work, people. I've had the honor of working with Anel, so it's exciting for me to have like these different overlaps of the way that we engage with one another and grow together. And so we've even been discussing a bit, thinking about as members of the subcommittee to counter anti-Black racism in this organization. We've talked a lot about the potential for this, the work we have to do internally, individually, institutionally, and systemically. So I'm excited for this. So this month, our resource was The Weaponization of English, which was an article by Dr. Kisha C. Bryan and JP Gerald. And as is our practice internally, we reviewed the resource. We discussed it with our executive board. And the questions that we're going to be talking about today were formulated by the executive board. So that is our internal process, really to build community around important issues, but also to gain deeper familiarity with every pass. So just to give you a brief overview, the article had an intro and a closure, but the three subtopics that were addressed were the power of coded language. And then there was fight the power, or actually the second one was make me want to holler, position statements on anti-Black racism, which was very fitting because our first resource was a position statement. So that's really important. And finally, the last section was fight the power, making the performative actionable. So this is so on the nose. And now for where this conversation really should naturally evolve to. And just, I would love to know just right off the bat, what was your take on this resource this month?
My take, it really highlighted the work that we have to do. It's not just enough to say it, but to do it. And it reminded me a lot about things that I tell my own students, things that I say to my family, about myself, to my children. It's not enough to say it, but you have to do it. And the reason that you have to do it, because the last step is then you believe it. So you say it, then you do it, and you believe it. And what these words are actually saying, what they really mean, and if they're not actionable, then they're empty. And that was really what I took away. But as well, I gave you like real clear steps, like where is it lacking? These words are great, these words are not as great. This is how it's been used. This is how you should not use it. That was really powerful to me because it gave me actionable steps to take that I think that we can definitely use as an organization, but also like within our classrooms, with our students, within ourselves. And that's really important.
Yeah, for sure. I couldn't agree more. I thought the time at which, or at least when I came across it, I thought it was very just timely because of all the statements that had come out. Mm-hmm. And rhetoric doesn't necessarily like do the work that we ourselves have to commit to. I think it's a part of the work, but I thought it was important that as we're in the midst of like looking at the statements and writing the statements and trying to word them well, like what comes behind those words. So I thought it was very meaty to be so short. But I do have some questions here that we all were a part of formulating, but there were so many. And I'm gonna be honest, like even looking at the first episode, we probably had like 14, 15, 18 questions, and we got to maybe 3 of them. And this time, I don't know if you counted them all, but I think we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 some odd questions.
There's a lot.
Yeah, so I know we won't get to them all, but again, like depth over breadth. So I'm okay with that. So jump right in with question 1. And this one was pulled from the first section, the power of coded language. And it says, can I recognize coded language when I see it? And then there were, and I guess when I hear it, and then there were a couple of even examples placed there. So protests versus looting, the use of the word criminals, or like, I guess when we think of students, there's other coded language around the way we talk about students. And I even added another example because I thought it was very pertinent with this passing election season, like even the way that President-elect Joe Biden addressed his constituency and said, well, you know, the Latinx population isn't like the Black population, they're diverse. So, you know, this language that we use around Blackness. So the question is asking, can I recognize coded language when I see it?
And that's a big one, right? Because I think there's a distinction between seeing and hearing. I think there's a distinction between capturing how people react to that language too. So maybe I don't react when my students react, maybe someone in the room reacts, and I have to be sensitive to that. So I think that that goes back to the can means how educated are you on these issues, that you can not only understand where these words are coming from, but the history and the legacy and the powers that they engage when they are spoken. Words can be very powerful and engaged in certain contexts when they come from certain mouths. And the way we use them shows us how much we truly understand and are knowledgeable. So the can I recognize when I hear it and when I see it goes back to, do you know where this is coming from? How are you using it? And are you aware of how it's affecting others? It really depends on those 3 things, I think.
I think something key from what you just said, and I'm going to resist getting into, shout out to Dr. Flores, the ratio-linguistic ideologies, right? I'm going to resist because I want to go there. But you already tapped into speaker versus listener. And I think that was really important to highlight, just because oftentimes there's a hyper focus on intent versus impact. And to be able to distinguish between, it's one thing to feel that you're cognizant when something is escaping your own mouth, as opposed to being open to recognizing that despite your inability to sense that something that was produced from your mouth could have caused harm, that you also have to own the reactions of folks when they mirror back to you. Mm-hmm. That something that has escaped your mouth has done harm. So that's really, I think, powerful that you brought up that, you know, speaker, listener, intent, impact kind of distinction. There's another question from the Make Me Wanna Holler section of the article. It's a bit long, so I might have to restate it a couple times. It says, beyond stating our beliefs, our position, what explicit commitments can we make regarding our organization's role in countering anti-Black racism? So beyond our beliefs and position, what explicit commitments can we make to countering anti-Black racism?
I think that's the most important question we can ask, because it's not enough to say stand in solidarity with you, but how are you going to show that? What actions are you going to take? So if we think back to the classroom and we think back to our learning objectives, right? And our language objectives, it's, I can do this by doing that, by engaging this, by working in this way or with a partner, or taking these actual steps. And to me, if we don't have that part, it's empty. So it's, I stand in solidarity with you. How? And what are you going to do to show that and to really show support, to bring this work forward, to dismantle these ideologies and these premises and these powers that be that marginalize and silence and minoritize and racialize. When are you going to do it? I think that's really important too. I'm going to donate money. I'm going to look at my board rules and regulations. I'm going to stop using this language. When are you going to do that? What steps are you going to take? What's your process? What's your procedure? It's an issue of transparency for me, because if you're not willing to give me your action plan, as flawed as it may be, how am I going to know that you really are standing with me? What that breeds is distrust. And then there is no power to your words. There's a phenomenal expression in Spanish that we use in my homeland, in the Dominican Republic. Crea fama y acuéstate a dormir. Okay, your legacy, create your legacy, and then take a step back, because that will speak for itself. But if all you're doing is speaking and you're not doing anything, you're not showing me steps, you're not showing me actual changes that are going to be evident in what you say and what you do, in the conferences you put out, and the presenters that you put in front of you, in the action statements, in the lobbying efforts, and including someone at the table and giving them a voice and using the right pronouns and the right terminologies, eliminating that coded language, it's nothing. So I want to see a timeline. I want to see steps. I want to see a process. And then I want to see a reflection, because it's going to be flawed. It's going to be messy. You're going to think that this is going to work so great. And then you do it and you go, oh my gosh, that didn't work out so well. I wasn't expecting this. I didn't plan for that. You notice your own like gaps, right? Your own misconceptions and your own work you have to do as you're going through it. But that's part of it. So I think that those 4 steps are, to me, the most important, because if not, it's just words. We saw so many commercials. Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. I haven't seen much follow-up. Schools, we're going to look at our curriculum. So what did you find? What did you discover? What are you doing differently? What authors are you showing? What messages are you giving the kids? What conversations have you had? How have you asked me as a parent to support you in this work, to sit down with my child and support you in this mission? How are you supporting me in this mission? Until you see that, it's just words.
Just words. I there's a lot that you just said that's like my brain is just firing off. But the 2 things that are really sticking with me right now are transparency and time, right? And so this notion that there's words here and there's intent, right? Back to intent, impact. But if you don't have an actual timeline, like for an expected execution, we know that it could be incrementalism to death, right? To the point that nothing ever transpires. And then we know that we are just centering whiteness again. The comfort of the status quo means it can always be projected into the future when things will change, because it's not actually hurting you. And so you have all the time in the world. On the transparency piece as well, I bring this up in different spaces, but for sure, we realize that when it comes to efforts around countering anti-Blackness, we lack concrete, I wouldn't even say black and white, but like concrete established expectations that we can go back and measure ourselves against. And I think that that is a tactic. I think that is that so that we can say, or that we can like revise what we had previously discussed and say, oh, did I say that? Oh, that's not what I meant by that. Right. And so the transparency adds to accountability. So transparency and time for me, based on what you just said, really stand out to me as parts that, you know, in matching that section of the article, make me want to holler. The statements, we don't want them to just be words. And I know that we're working from like that graphic, that framework that I gave the committee with the individual, the institution, and the system. And so my follow-up for that would be in terms of moving from words to off the statement, off the paper into real life. On an institutional level, we kind of got at, how do you see that as something that can happen on an individual level for you?
So the steps, I can speak to that kind of really personally, to do my own work with this, and it is a moment of doing what you're going to do, laying it out, but taking a really big step back and looking almost macro, like, what am I missing? I know I have to center. So having that goal, I have to center the voice, the experience, the love, because we don't want to re-traumatize. I don't want to center damaging anything, rhetoric, discourse, images. That's not what I'm about. Um, to quote Dr. Bettina Love at a wonderful conference that we attended on Saturday, the answer to anti-Blackness is Black love. How am I centering Black love? Am I being, do I see it? Is it visible? And do I have a voice? Is it heard somewhere? Is it a video clip? Is it a book? Is it an author? And I think that goes hand in hand. Black word with the Black voice, with the Black love. And it has to start with that. So am I centering that? Is that front and center? Is it marginal? Is it marginal? Is it the first thing that I show? When and where is it entering? How am I approaching it? How am I engaging with it? How am I engaging students, my teacher candidates, as well as my babies, as I call them? When I was working in K-12, they were always my babies. How am I centering that voice? Starting there, because what we do then is that it grows out, right? That's the center. It starts with you, and then you can go in and you go, you know what, this curriculum needs changing. My syllabus needs changing. The way I talk to the friends that I have, who do I need to pull in? Who do I need to turn to? Who do I need to have conversations with? Who I need to lend into my heart and soul, into my family? How am I centering that experience? But again, it's the love, not the trauma, but the love. And I'm not saying that we don't need to know those histories and we need to know those legacies, but I think that we need to show the other half in order to create healing. Okay, we diagnose the infection, but we treat it with an antibiotic, right? We need that Black love, centering that Black love and letting that permeate and create that change in all of us. And so that's what I do personally, so that I can go back and say, you know what, we need more Black scholars. We need more Black readings in all of our courses, bilingual education, methods, theories of language. We need all of that. And then I need activities, and I need them to go into the community and work with these kids in a positive manner. It's how it grows.
Mm-hmm.
It goes that way, but it starts with you.
I love that you say it starts with you. And I mean, Dr. Bettina Love is like, forget about it, rock star status. But alongside her, in terms of linguistic justice, it also brings me to Dr. Baker Bell. And I consumed her book, and just like couldn't get enough of it. And when we talk about Black voices, I just think it's so powerful how you point to all the ways that it is or is not showing up within our instruction. But also, like when you said bringing it close to you as the individual, if we don't have those representations in a meaningful way in our personal lives, it's gonna show up in our instruction. And I've been through that, and I've shared that, like in consulting work that I do, I always start with a vulnerable reflection, because I realize our profession already is one that's constantly, it feels like you're under attack. And so I don't ever want teachers to feel like here's another thing that someone's telling me that I'm falling short. So I try to start from the vulnerable place. But something that I realized that you referenced about bringing it close to you and reflecting is that if we don't keep Blackness in our circles, that you're going to be outed in your instruction, because your language will betray you. You'll say things that don't hit right. You'll engage in trauma and negative kind of representations unbeknownst to you. And it will reveal that nobody in your life is checking you, that nobody's saying to you, that ain't it. And my fascination with the work of Dr. Baker Bell is that her work seems so personal to me. The way she writes is not an out there kind of writing. It's, you know, she starts talking and she's like, I'm from the D. Like she immediately starts talking about Detroit, talking about the language that she was raised with. And it feels good to read a text that you feel like somebody's talking to you, not through you, over, past, and behind you.
Yes.
And so that to me is representative of the possibilities in our instruction when this is a personal work, as opposed to some distanced highbrow academic, or even like a more of an economically driven pursuit. It shows up. It shows up when it's not personal. So I really appreciate you kind of speaking to those layers of it. And, maybe we'll pull the graphic at some point kind of into even the critical conversations, because I do want folks to realize that the way that we're doing this work is meant to be vulnerable, and it's meant to be, maybe we fall down, but this is never worth abandoning, no matter how much we misstep. At some point, we've got to be either called out or called in, corrected, and acknowledge that, right? Like, yeah, it makes sense that if you've been socialized, and our entire society has been socialized after so many generations to pretend that the traumas and it's not all that, it's also the ignoring of the Black contributions to society and whatnot. There's so much erasure, omission, and distortion that it takes a lot of work to see it. So we should expect that we're going to mess up along the way.
And it's going to take a lot of time. That's the other caveat. This is not an overnight thing. This is not something that takes a month, that it takes a year. It's almost like, so I taught literacy. So we have this, the cycle of literacy, the writing process. This is a process, and this is a constant undoing. And the other real danger is that this is only happening in certain classrooms. This is a literacy thing. It's an English teacher thing. What about math? What about who is included in STEM? Who's represented in STEM? Who are those teachers? How are Black girls being posited towards advanced mathematics? The sciences, the hard sciences, biology, physics, chemistry, bilingual education. Was talking about anti-Blackness within our own languaging practices of Spanish and English. This summer with a few colleagues, Diana Cornwall, Alex Cuchinota, we took advantage of the movement, the youth movement happening within our township, and we tackled it. And it took almost 3 weeks before the kids could say and see, when I say this is coming from anti-Blackness. This issue I have with my hair, that's stemming from anti-Blackness. It took time to even just recognize. That's how ingrained it is in our society and in who we see, how we see ourselves in the mirror. We're looking at ourselves under a distorted mirror. And if we don't take the time to just identify, like start with Bloom's taxonomy, identify, and then we, go up the chain, up the taxonomy, up the pyramid, is not going to happen. So it's a commitment. That's, we were talking about action steps. It's a commitment that's actionable with a time frame. My first step is going to be this, I'm going to do it then, and know that this is a process. It's going to take a lot of time. And those of us that have been marginalized, that have been racialized, it takes a lot of undoing before you can start healing, and then before you can go out into the world and start to also dismantle. So if there's a process there, maybe I just outlined it, right? Identify, undo, heal, resist, fight.
Fight.
I do want to mention that because it's something that I don't feel like we're talking enough about. Like this is ubiquitous. It is everywhere, in every place, in every language. Like we have actual phrases in Spanish that showcase this, and it's ugly, and we have to face that, undo it, heal it, resist it, and help others do the same.
It's funny that you went to, we have to fight, because like the third section of the article, it's called Fight the Power. And it was hard for me to pick only one question because of the complexity that you're pointing to. This complexity around how it's embedded, it's naturalized, right, in our language practices, such that we reinforce it without even noticing that we reinforce white supremacy, because to us, we're just talking and this is just what you say, right? And I spoke to someone earlier this week who was asking me about these kind of naturalized, embedded anti-Black language practices within like multilingual learners and how it manifests globally. And I didn't even think of this until you said it, but like I remember a moment abroad, I was at a party you know, I lived in Spain for a year and everybody's passing around food and they're like, ¿Quieres brazo de gitano? And I was like, I'm sorry, what? Brazo de gitano quieres?
Oh,
And so I'm like, I know my Spanish ain't great, but I'm pretty sure they just said, do you want gypsy arm? And so I look at the cake and sure enough, the cake is brown. And so because the cake is brown, they call it gypsy arm, right? And so even as someone who had not formally studied any of this and someone who had been socialized in white supremacy, I was like, this ain't it, this ain't right. But again, like to them, they were offering me cake, right? Not even making these.
Why would you have some?
But clearly, right? And so I know that's probably an exaggerated version, and it's not even, to me, some of the even more complex spaces of dealing with the linguistic anti-Black racism appears in the Caribbean, where there's so many Black multilingual speakers, Black Spanish speakers, and things of that nature. I know Spain might be more of an easy target, if you will, but you're saying that just made me think of that example and how when you don't have the language for it, it's hard to talk about. So all I knew in that moment was, ooh, this isn't right. So
it's so important to, and that part of the article speaks a lot about coded language, the terms that we use, the histories that, the legacies that they bring, right? Being able to call into question, to offer other examples. If we have counter narratives, I'm going to offer counter terms, counter terminologies for this as well. It's providing our families and our friends and ourselves and our students alternate discourses, other ways that can evoke different imaginings. And that's part of the work as well. Finding other ways to have conversations that don't damage and don't bring in a legacy of power that is damaging.
For sure. And that leads me to the third question and thinking about not even just creating, but revealing the long-standing alternate like ways of languaging our realities that have always been, particularly in Black communities, where you may not control the dominant narrative, but your counter narrative is live, like it's been there, and it's just hidden from mainstream discourse. And so I think this is a perfect follow-up when we're thinking about the nuance of anti-Blackness, particularly globally. This is from the Fight the Power section. It says, how can we as an institution identify and dismantle the colorism that limits opportunities for emerging bilinguals?
Dismantling the colorism that limits opportunities for emerging bilinguals. Oof, where do I begin? I think it starts with who has a seat at the table at an organization, who's sitting on that board, who's saying what, who's being silenced. Someone just said something. Did you interrupt that person? Did you write down what they said? Did you silence them? Did you mute them? Did you kick them out of the Zoom meeting? Do we have a moment to stop and recognize that we are all emerging bilinguals, depending on the context that we're in and the opportunities that we have to use language? Did we stop to think about how we are being perceived? Is there a white listening subject telling you that what someone is saying is unintelligible? We can't have this conversation without talking about Dr. Floris's work. We can't. We have to connect. We have to draw attention to, we have to name it first, name the ghost, dispel the ghost. We have to draw attention to the way language is used to racialize bodies and racialize speakers, and therefore make unintelligible what they are offering, the perspectives, the epistemologies, and the ontologies that we center when we're making decisions in policy and curriculum work, the stories that we're centering. That's how we dismantle by taking it off the shelf and putting something else in its place. That's how we dismantle. We put the emerging bilingual first because we are all emerging bilinguals. We all are learning language. I'm getting a third degree. My husband has a degree in several certificates. He talks to me about construction. I'm like, mi amor, English or Spanish, please?
Yeah, one of them, right?
I don't understand what he's saying. And
you got to pre-teach that vocabulary, you know?
we're fluent speakers, right? but we're all emerging bilinguals. So knowing our limitations, you don't know what you don't know. And you only know what you do know to a certain extent, to a certain context, I think. You dismantle by taking out that normative subject, putting in its place the centering of the people who need protected, protecting those minoritized students, again, identifying, undoing, healing, resisting. That's how we dismantle all these ideologies that marginalize emerging bilinguals. It's making sure that they are front and center. It's making sure that we are looking at the world the way they do, the way we do, the way we need to look at the world in order to really make systematic change. That's how we do it. We start there, not end there, or oops there.
I appreciate like the intentionality that you're pointing towards, because there's no way you can plan to do such a monumental work, like you said, by oopsing, right? Like it has to be thoughtful, and you've got to bring not just like the insights, but the whole humans to the decision making space. Because we have actually seen like representative, if you want to call it allyship, where I'll cite you, but I don't really want to work with you or talk to you or engage you in any meaningful way, right? So we don't want this kind of like pro forma citing of like, oh yeah, I talked to such and such, or according to this scholar, but rather, are you actually engaging with those communities in a meaningful way? Because I think, again, that's how the whole language betraying you thing, not because it won't happen, everybody has to grow, so it could still happen. But in having folks be voiced, you need the folks, right? And so bringing the ideas along with the humanity of the people to the table is something that I don't necessarily hear enough of. And I appreciate so much the personal examples of what it means to be an emerging bilingual, and who's intelligible and in what context is so central to this. Because just because certain folks don't get to take up spaces that are considered dominant or empowered doesn't mean that they don't exist in contexts wherein the dominant folks would they themselves become unintelligible. And I think that to me is what really blows my mind about Dr. Flores's work, because of it's never called a thing. It's not an entity, it's a practice. And when you take language to be a practice, you cease to have the ability to disembody it from the people. Mm-hmm. And that is a legacy of dehumanization that, if we can interrupt in any way, I think is going to be powerful. I wanted to ask you to do the same thing that we did on the last question. It's like thinking the institutional way. In terms of colorism, is there any like way that you see forward, even in your personal experience among your students or among your practices? Because me, for example, I know for a fact in all the work that I have been pushing into with bilingual ed, there isn't anything around. We have a huge population in the state of Haitian Creole speakers. I never see anything that's for them, representative of them, which would connote an investment curricularly, financially. When we talk about colorism, clearly there are fairer skinned Haitians, right? But by and large, folks make the distinction between different populations, unfortunately, based on phenotype. And so when we come to know Haitian Creole speakers as Black, there's a clear line drawn in terms of resources around who is centered and who's marginalized. So I'm curious about any insight or curiosities you have around that yourself.
Something that I'm working on myself, you know. I wish I had a quick answer to it, and I admit, here's my limitation, that I don't. Going back to like the institutional, so thinking education as an institution, taking that, I'm looking at it from that stance. I've always resisted the idea that if you look for it, oh, I can't find it. To me, that means you're not looking deep enough, or you're not creating it. Again, I'm thinking literature. Of course, there must be books that capture that voice and that experience and that authorship. We just haven't dug deep enough to find it. I remember I've pulled pieces straight from, I worked with a wonderful colleague who was from Cuba, and she would bring me books from Cuba. I have aunts who send me books from the Dominican Republic. And those were the books that I used with my kids because that's what they sounded like. Those were their experiences. That's one way, right? Dig deeper, create it with them, invite those people into that space. So it's not like I'm looking for a Latinx person and, you know, I'm white presenting. I own that. I own that. And I feel like sometimes I'm invited to the table because I'm just the right amount, you know, just enough to make people not uncomfortable. And I own that too. And I think there are times where I wonder, should I be recusing myself to make space for someone else so that I do the work of lifting? Does that make sense?
All of it.
Making sure that I'm not taking a seat that I don't deserve. I've thought a lot about that especially this last 2 years as I go from being a practitioner to a scholar, to an emerging scholar, an emerging researcher. At what points do I need to make sure that I either don't sit at the table so that someone else can, or I scooch to the side and make sure somebody else sits with me? I bring in a parent, I bring in a community member, I bring in that experience and that voice, center them, silence myself so they can speak and be heard. And if they aren't, to lend my power, to lend my voice to that. I think that's part of it as well. If we're going to tackle that, we need to be able to sacrifice the privileges that people who look like me and sound like me and have the languages and language in the ways that I do can make space for someone else, so that becomes the center and that becomes the norm. I need to do that work too. I need to sacrifice too. And I think that's a huge part of it. That might mean lost opportunities. That might mean lost incomes. That might mean loss. But if we're going to get there together, that might be what we have to do. So that might be something to think about really critically.
That's a lot to think about. I really appreciate you digging to that space. And I think the two things that stick out for me about what you said was, number one, the co-construction. You know, I'm obsessed with co-constructing learning environments. I can't teach without it. I need my learners to be my co-learners. And also you point to the obvious oversight in our classrooms where folks say, I don't have the resources. Those babies in front of you are a resource. It's not their job, but you have the power to support them and being an expert in the space of who they are. So that was a beautiful thing that you said that I'm so glad that you brought to the fore. And the second part is really robustly acknowledging how anti-Black racism manifests. And yes, it is a social construct. Race is a social construct, but it has material impacts. And so if you really want to interrupt it, you've got to make some material sacrifices. And I don't think that there's anything more that we could add to this episode to let folks marinate on. I myself just want to sit with that a bit and really think about what that means for us as an organization, right? Knowing when you're taking up space and when you need to relinquish that space, knowing when you can use the power and if you know you have it, right? And that's the clause, the if clause. You can't give up something you don't acknowledge having. So it's a much deeper work. So Anel, oh my gosh, gracias por todo. No puedo creer las cosas que me han dicho aquí. I am chewing and thinking and reflecting, and I really appreciate it.
Gracias a ti for inviting me, A. B, letting me think with you. Conversations are moments to think together and hacia adelante.
Hacia
En la
adelante.
lucha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week for NJTESOL-NJBE's Critical Conversation. I'm your host, Tasha Austin, and we'll see you next time.